the way for the next sessions, which is under the topic Innovations in Sovereign Wealth Funds for National Development. And the speaker today is Mr. Christopher Balding. Before I invite Mr. Balding on the stage, I would like to give to all of you a brief profile of the speaker. Mr. Christopher Balding is an associate professor in business and economics at the HSBC Business School for Peking University Graduate School in Shenzhen in China, public PRC, a leading expert on sovereign wealth funds. His book, Sovereign Wealth Funds, The New Intersection of Money and Power, published by Oxford University Press, has been called an excellent source, focusing on their evolution from one simple cash management operation to giants of global finance with trillions of US dollars in assets under management. His book really brings new insights in their history, policy motivation, success, and failures. And I think it's time that I would like to invite Mr. Christopher Balding on the stage. Please give him a big warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me today here. I'm very honored to be here. I've been enjoying the past 2 weeks in Thailand. I love coming to Thailand. My daughter's primary concern when she found out that we were coming to Bangkok so Daddy could work was whether or not there was a pool and she could go swimming. So we've been very much enjoying Thailand. I want to thank the Thai Security and Exchange Commission and the Nations Group for inviting me to speak today. This is a great honor, and I hope it will be beneficial to you as well. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister and Dr. Vorapol. It was wonderful to hear your opening remarks. Since sovereign wealth funds first garner global attention as vehicles of government-led investment, concern is primarily focused on their unique ability to merge the most feared elements of the public and private sectors, the power of private finance and state coerciveness. Governments that could successfully harness financial ability of capital markets under the auspices of state control would dominate global economy and diplomatic circles. However, as sovereign wealth funds sprang up like hedge funds, many of them ill-conceived, borrowing boilerplate language on investment mandates and corporate governance, their true purpose was lost in the delirious haze of growth projections. Who can forget the poorly timed Irish sovereign wealth fund? Sovereign wealth funds were not originally created to establish the perfect blend of state-centric coercive power and market-oriented financial acumen, but to solve very real economic policy dilemmas. The first sovereign wealth fund, as was just mentioned, began as a small cash management operation in one room borrowed from the Bank of England, overseeing an oil-driven current account surplus. 60 years later, most sovereign wealth funds continue to fulfill this original mandate by sterilizing capital inflows while also managing more sophisticated asset management operations. Their primary purpose is to seek a higher rate of return than is on offer for most sovereign debt offered. Sovereign wealth funds were not created to dominate the global economy, but rather much more mundane objectives like limiting currency pressures, inflation, managing foreign exchange reserves for commodity-dependent countries. Commodity-dependent countries are inextricably linked to the commodity global cycle of prices, causing repeated booms and busts that we see over and over again, primarily in emerging markets. It is this framework for sovereign wealth fund creation that should inform our understanding of their purpose and activities, especially as one is being considered here in Thailand. There is a long history of governments linking sovereign wealth fund activities and national development policy objectives. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, to positively link sovereign wealth funds and national development objectives has proven very problematic. And today I'm going to give you, more often than not, some of the negative outcomes, some of the advice on things that should not be done with regards to sovereign wealth funds. Most original sovereign wealth funds were making valuable economic policy innovations to prevent inflation and macroeconomic instability. Most new sovereign wealth funds are being used to distort markets, hindering national development. The landscape of sovereign wealth funds today is dominated by vanity funds that seem better suited for the purpose of joining a sovereign country club rather than funds designed to solve policy and development questions. The highest quality innovations that we see in sovereign wealth funds come from the oldest funds, but are lessons well learned. Let me give you 3 points in particular that you should think about when thinking about sovereign wealth funds, especially when linking national development objectives. First, sovereign wealth funds need a predictable and dedicated capital source. Let me repeat that. A sovereign wealth fund needs a dedicated and predictable capital source. Dominated primarily by commodity-dependent countries, most sovereign wealth funds simply receive monetized natural resource wealth. The ongoing commodity extraction allows sovereign wealth funds to build up a capital base based upon the monetization of their existing natural resources. Countries that monetize natural resources are no wealthier after contributing to their sovereign wealth fund because their wealth has purely been monetized. It has been taken out of the ground and turned into a financial asset. That's all. Mongolia, which is currently experiencing an enormous commodity-driven boom, for instance, would be a prime candidate for the consideration of the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund, considering their allocation of portfolio and their current windfall towards a sovereign wealth fund. This would help sterilize the capital inflows, reduce inflationary pressures, and it comes from a dedicated, ongoing, predictable source. In countries without such a clear funding source, it is unclear that the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund is wise due to the incredibly distortionary policies it requires. Singapore, for instance, is a non-commodity-based fund country and has had to run long-term current account and government surpluses that regularly top 30% of GDP. Singapore has also become the 12th most indebted country in the world. These introduce incredibly distortionary policies requiring enormous public savings and incredible indebtedness. A sovereign wealth fund is simply public savings that needs to be paid for, whether it's paid for out of collection of tax revenue or whether it's paid for out of some type of natural resource wealth. Sovereign wealth funds are simply public savings that needs to be paid for. In the absence of existing national wealth, such as natural resources, countries should seriously review the distortions they plan on introducing. Whether a country relies heavily on commodity exports or not, sovereign wealth funds as a public savings tool should draw capital from an ongoing and predictable source. Second, sovereign wealth funds need to lay out clear and defined rules for fund withdrawals. The absence of clear and predictable rules have relegated many sovereign wealth funds to little more than political slush funds. This is proving very problematic for many countries that have large funds as to how they use this capital. Russia, for instance, created the Sovereign Wealth Fund in the early 2000s with clear rules for fund accrual when oil surpassed $28 a barrel. However, as oil floated around $100 a barrel, Russian politicians chafed at the restrictions that allowed their sovereign fund to accrue so much capital so fast. They subsequently rewrote the Sovereign Wealth Fund legislation, removing virtually all limits on withdrawals and all requirements for capital accrual, and consequently, in the past 4 years, despite oil remaining around $100 a barrel, the size of the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Russia has remained virtually unchanged due to enormous increases in public spending. Since 2007, Russian public spending has more than doubled, and over the past decade, it's increased nearly 1,000%. That type of public spending is simply unsustainable and not beneficial for Russia. A better example, however, is Norway. Norway strictly limits its non-oil budget deficit to 4% of GDP. This has a couple of beneficial characteristics. First, it explicitly links public expenditure to both the non-oil economy and the expected long-run real rate of return on financial assets. This benefits the country by promoting very predictable rules for fund withdrawal. Creating strong and transparent rules for fund capital accrual and withdrawals will reduce the temptation for politically motivated spending and investment. Third, a sovereign wealth fund needs the highest level of independence possible while technically remaining a state-linked entity. Early fears about the politicization of sovereign wealth fund investment focused on their impact of international investment, but ignored the enormous impact that they have on domestic markets. When in fact, the most repeated and egregious distortions that we see on sovereign wealth fund investment is on domestic markets. Sovereign wealth funds must remain profit-motivated investors free from political whims and capricious spending. Unfortunately, in domestic environments, this is more the exception than the rule. Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and Singapore, sovereign wealth funds are all managed by family members of the heads of state, creating clear conflicts of interest. It was in Dubai recently that there was the first sovereign wealth fund debt default, which created enormous problems as the fund was essentially overseen by the ruling family. In the Arab Spring, we've actually witnessed sovereign wealth funds giving money to populations to maintain national harmony. The China Investment Corporation has built an international portfolio consisting primarily of financial services, natural resources, and high-tech companies based on the mandates of Beijing. Sovereign wealth funds must have the independence to pursue its investment objectives, maximizing their risk-adjusted returns, rather than pursuing political investment based upon politicians' whims. So how do we then align the need for profit-motivated sovereign wealth fund with national development objectives? I believe that there's a profound misconception that an independent, profit-motivated sovereign wealth fund will be at odds with national development objectives. Sovereign wealth funds may differ from government or political objectives, but that is significantly different than national development goals. So how can sovereign wealth funds pursue national development goals free from political influence? First, I think we should separate operational and capital development objectives. Education, for instance, is a good national development goal, but should be considered an operational funding need paid for out of the operations budget of the government. However, as a long-term investor, sovereign wealth funds are well placed for long-term stable investments. Let me give you a couple of examples. Sovereign wealth funds could be co-investors in large infrastructure projects such as airports, ports, power generations, transmission, and roads. These types of investments have been used around the world by a variety of large profit-motivated investors, funds, and investment banks. To give you one example, the Australian investment bank Macquarie became a global leader in profitable infrastructure investment projects across a range of industries such as airports, ports, power, and highway. These are no longer World Bank donor development handouts, but they are projects that attract major global investors. Virtually every major investment bank that I know of has a major unit dedicated to project finance, specifically in emerging markets. These are no longer the World Bank USAID handout projects that we see. These are profit-oriented projects that can be pursued by sovereign wealth funds and investment banks. As Dr. Vorapol noted himself just a few minutes ago, these are projects that Thailand is engaging in and are the types of projects that a sovereign wealth fund could actively engage in and profit from. Second, moving beyond obvious public-private partnership investment opportunities, sovereign wealth funds can promote national development objectives by deepening domestic capital markets. The performance standards and transparency of a well-functioning modern capital market can benefit domestic firms, the government, and sovereign wealth funds. In the couple of weeks that I've been here, I was reading an article that said in a survey of Thai business that they expended 30 to 35% of the cost of a project bribing officials to obtain government contracts. That is an enormous amount. One of the things that capital markets can do is provide pricing transparency where everybody can see what is being paid for an asset, how much costs are on projects. Sovereign wealth funds especially make tempting targets for politically motivated spending and investment, and great care must be taken to avoid these pitfalls. Though I retain an incredibly profound concern about the political motivation of sovereign wealth funds in domestic markets, I believe there are ways to mitigate these risks. For instance, giving external managers investment capital with a domestic mandate, such as publicly benchmarking both their performance and their costs against other managers. Benchmarking is used by in numerous sovereign wealth funds to compare managers that they outsource asset management to compare internal managers to external managers, and this way these are costs and benefits that can be seen by the public, can be seen by outside audit committees, interested parties. By publishing these results and the cost of managers with domestic mandates, this will allow the sovereign wealth fund capital to be invested domestically, but also allow great scrutiny on the costs and the returns. Another idea to consider is a prohibition on non-public securities such as private equity. I mean no disrespect to private equity, as I used to work in the industry. However, allowing public investment in vehicles like private equity increases the opportunity for accounting manipulation and public policy disguised to benefit specific firms. And in fact, this is not unique to public entities such as sovereign wealth funds. Accounting manipulation is much higher in the private equity industry and in areas where firms can easily manipulate returns and balance sheets without the pricing transparency of public markets. And we see this actually happening in sovereign wealth funds. Let me give you two examples. The China Investment Corporation purchased nearly $200 billion in assets for $65 billion. In Singapore, manipulated public finances and creative valuations designed to hide losses are the norm. So we see this type of accounting manipulation played out regularly. These are the types of pitfalls that need to be avoided when creating a sovereign wealth fund. Even more than international investors, governments and sovereign wealth funds, as profit-motivated investors, should go to great lengths to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. These are public funds that are being invested. These are not private risk capital that can be lost. Third, sovereign wealth funds with prudent and restrained framework for capital withdrawal provide governments the ability to make long-term budgetary plans regardless of the global or the domestic business cycle. Especially in commodity-dependent economies, but even in most relatively diversified emerging markets, there is a significantly higher macroeconomic volatility which can be restrained through the prudent use of sovereign wealth fund capital withdrawal. Reliance on the global business cycle and volatile commodity prices exacerbate this boom and bust cycle. But sovereign wealth funds can allow governments to plan longer term across business cycles. Sovereign wealth funds with a prudent framework for capital withdrawal and investment provide the freedom to promote public investment regardless of the global business cycle. It should not be used to fund either consumption or ongoing deficits, but public investment that outlasts the short and medium-term business cycle. By funding investment across the business cycle, this can act as an economic stabilizer in times of falling global demand. Fourth, sovereign wealth funds can promote national development objectives by stimulating domestic spillovers. Sovereign wealth funds occupy a unique position as guardians of national wealth. However, they also have very clear profit mandates. Because of this, they can stimulate development objectives by stimulating human capital development and external service providers. Let me give you a couple of examples. Singapore offered to outsource some asset management to fund managers willing to relocate a certain number and quality of jobs to Singapore in an attempt to stimulate the financial services sector. This played a significant role in helping establish Singapore as a regional financial center. As the local talent pool increased, firms sought to provide new services, expanded their operation, and new firms entered the market. Given the relatively low barriers to entry in many financial services, sovereign wealth funds can stimulate these local spillovers by encouraging nascent firms and domestic talent. Another fund that I'm quite well familiar with, they provide free schooling to local students accepted into elite global business, economic, and financial graduate programs, provided they work for the sovereign fund for a specified time after graduation. This helps send more students to elite global business programs. This stimulates the local development of talent and labor. And many of these people go on to become like Dr. Vorapol, that represent the SEC. They start additional firms, and this continues a virtuous cycle. Programs like this provide a ready talent pool that breeds the next generation of leaders. Sovereign wealth funds can target national development objectives in broader ways that also serve their own narrow interests. As I was talking backstage with a couple people today, including Dr. Vorapol, they were asking me about what I was going to say, and what I told them is I said there are many more cautionary tales about what to do with the sovereign wealth fund than there are successful examples. Creating a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund is not for the faint of heart. There are too many sovereign wealth funds in recent histories that have been created to join what the economists called the most expensive club in the world, rather than with a sound investment mandate or economic policy solution. I want to emphasize, I don't mean to sound anti-sovereign wealth fund, as that's not my intention here today in the least. There are, however, many pitfalls when structuring a sovereign wealth fund that must be considered to avoid political influence, coordinate macroeconomic policy, create sound investment mandates, and establish a framework for capital withdrawals from the fund. Even many of the largest and most respected sovereign wealth funds suffer from the problems outlined here today. Countries need to outline their policy objectives, safeguards, strict investment mandates, rather than establishing sovereign wealth funds based upon unrealistic visions of growth, capital, and national development objectives. While sovereign wealth funds can be a very useful tool, they can also exacerbate some of the worst tendencies that we see in politically motivated spending, especially on domestic markets. Thank you very much, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, that was Mr. Christopher Balding. Is there any questions relating to the topic sovereign fund? Any questions? Seems to be as clear as the previous sessions. So thank you very much, Mr. Balding, and please give him big